Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are coming online. It is my great honor to welcome you to the 2021 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. My name is Kyungmi Kim and I'll be your MC for this conference. I would like to greet you. Today's conference will be a useful platform for renowned experts and scholars from Korea and abroad who are virtually gathered to share their insights and outlooks on breaking the nuclear impasse. So we look forward to your active participation and interest. And also we have prepared the Q&A session, so please feel free to leave your comments or thoughts on our YouTube channel and get a giveaway. So without further ado, let us open the 2021 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs with a video clip on the history of our conference and this year's topic. Let's take a look. And next, His Excellency Chung Eui-yong, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, will give a keynote speech. Please welcome him.
참석자 여러분, 국립외교원 외교안보연구소에서 개최하는 2021년 IFANS 국제문제회의에 참석하신 것을 진심으로 환영합니다. 오늘 이 회의를 준비해 주신 김준영 원장을 비롯한 국립외교원의 모든 직원들에게도 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 한반도의 완전한 비핵화와 항구적 평화체제 구축은 특정 정부만의 과제가 아닌 우리 민족의 과제이며 핵 비확산과 세계평화 및 안정을 유지하려는 국제사회의 과제이기도 합니다. 우리 정부 초기까지 남북 및 북미 관계는 도발, 관여, 교착이라는 패턴이 반복되고 있었습니다. 특히 2017년 북한의 연이은 ICBM 발사 및 핵실험으로 인해 한반도에서는 일촉즉발의 위기가 조성되고 있었습니다. 그러나 2018년 이후 세 차례의 남북 정상회담과 두 차례의 북미 정상회담, 그리고 판문점에서의 남북미 정상 간 회동을 통해 남북미 정상들이 직접 한반도의 완전한 비핵화와 항구적 평화 정착을 위한 원칙에 합의하였습니다. 문재인 대통령은 북한의 계속되는 도발에도 불구하고 취임 직후 개최된 한미 정상회담의 공동성명, 바로 이어서 발표된 베를린 구상, 그리고 9월 유엔 총회 기조연설을 통해 북한에 대해 긴장 완화와 대화 재개를 위한 의지를 지속적으로 표명하였습니다. 또한 그간의 도발, 관여, 교착의 패턴을 극복하고 완전한 비핵화와 평화체제 구축을 이루어내기 위한 대북 관여의 틀과 구조를 만들어내기 위해 노력하였습니다. 그 결과 4.27 판문점 선언과 9.19 평양 공동선언을 통하여 신뢰 구축과 비핵화를 병렬적으로 추진할 수 있는 틀을 만들었으며 포괄적 군사 합의를 통하여 군사적 긴장을 완화함으로써 비핵화에 집중할 수 있는 환경을 조성하였습니다. 그리고 북미 정상 간 싱가포르 합의를 통하여 남북 관계와 북미 관계 발전이 상호 선순환할 수 있는 구조도 마련되었습니다. 2019년 2월 하노이 회담이 성과 없이 끝났음에도 불구하고 이러한 틀과 구조는 계속 유지되고 있습니다. 바이든 신행정부가 출범한 후 한미 양국은 지난 3월 2+2 회의에서 합의한 완전히 조율된 전략 하에 북한과의 대화를 재개하기 위해 지속적으로 노력하고 있습니다. 지난 5월 한미 정상회담에서는 판문점 선언과 싱가포르 공동성명 등 기존 합의의 연속성과 안정성을 유지하면서 외교와 대화를 통해 북핵 문제를 해결해 나가기로 합의하였습니다. 특히 바이든 대통령은 남북 대화와 관여, 협력에 대한 지지 입장을 표명하였습니다. 남북 관계와 북미 관계가 상호 선순환적으로 발전해야 한다는 점을 재확인한 것입니다. 북한도 대화의 문을 열기 위한 준비를 하고 있는 것으로 보입니다. 북한은 하노이 이후에도 핵실험 및 장거리 미사일 발사 모라토리움을 유지하고 있습니다. 남북 간 사실상 최초의 운용적 군비 통제 합의인 남북 군사 합의도 효과적으로 작동하고 있습니다. 북한은 현재 코로나19 방역과 국내 경제적 어려움 극복에 역량을 집중하고 있지만 김정은 총비서는 지난 6월 당 중앙위 전원회의에서 대화와 대결에 모두 준비되어 있어야 한다는 대외 메시지를 직접 공개적으로 언급하기도 하였습니다. 그리고 어제 7월 27일 남북 정상 간의 합의로 작년 6월부터 단절되었던 남북 간 통신 연락선이 완전히 복원되었습니다. 남북 통신선의 연결은 상호 신뢰를 회복하고 관계를 다시 발전시켜 나가겠다는 남북 정상들의 의지가 명확히 표현된 것입니다. 남북미 정상의 한반도의 완전한 비핵화와 항구적인 평화 정책에 대한 변함없는 의지는 한반도 평화 프로세스를 진전시켜 나가는 데 큰 힘이 될 것입니다. 우리 정부는 남북 정상 간의 의미 있는 7.27 합의를 계기로 남북 관계의 진전이 북미 관계의 진전으로도 이어지도록 최선의 노력을 다할 것입니다. 참석자 여러분, 중국은 우리의 전략적 협력 동반자로서 북핵 문제의 해결과 한반도 평화 체제의 구축을 위해 긴밀히 협력해 나가야 할 중요한 파트너입니다. 중국은 북핵 문제를 대화와 외교를 통해 평화적으로 해결해야 한다는데 우리와 인식을 같이 하고 있습니다. 한반도 정세를 안정적으로 관리하고 한반도 평화 프로세스를 진전시켜 나가기 위한 한중 간 협력이 더욱 확대되기를 희망합니다. 일본은 지리적으로나 문화적으로 우리의 가장 가까운 이웃이자 동북아와 세계 평화 번영을 위한 협력의 동반자입니다. 한일 양국은 과거의 역사를 직시하고 그로부터 교훈을 얻으려는 겸허한 자세를 견지하면서 양국 관계를 미래지향적으로 발전시키기 위해 노력해 나가야 합니다. 또한 북한의 핵과 미사일 문제는 한국과 일본이 미국과 함께 풀어나가야 할 중요한 과제입니다. 참석자 여러분, 한반도의 완전한 비핵화와 항구적 평화체제 구축을 통해 동북아 및 세계 평화와 번영을 도모하기 위해서는 한반도의 두 당사국 외에 모든 관련국의 협력과 지혜를 모아야 합니다. 한반도 평화 프로세스는 중단 없이 지속되어야 합니다. 우리 정부는 지속 가능한 성과를 만들어내기 위하여 서두르지 않으면서 최선을 다할 것입니다. 이러한 의미에서 금년도 IFANS 국제문제회의가 선정한 핵 교착 타개, 북핵과 한반도 평화라는 주제는 매우 시의적절한 것입니다. 이번 회의에는 북핵 협상의 실무적 경험과 이론을 겸비한 국내외 최고 전문가들이 패널리스트로 참가하고 계십니다. 이번 회의가 향후 북한과의 대화 재개와 한반도의 완전한 비핵화 및 항구적 평화 정착의 실질적 진전을 위한 현실적이고 실현 가능한 방안을 모색하는 데 기여할 수 있을 것으로 기대합니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Minister John, for the insightful speech. Now let us proceed to begin the first session on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and peace in Asia. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Chancellor Kim Jun-hyung of the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. And we have 5 wonderful panelists. First, President John Hamley of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and also former U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea, His Excellency Mark Lippert. Thank you. Professor Nobukatsu Kanehara at Doshisha University, and also Professor Jia Chunhwa at Peking University. And last but not least, Professor Hwang Il-do at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. So from now on, Chancellor Kim will moderate the first session.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Greetings from Seoul, including virtual audience all over the world. Welcome to 2021 IFANS Signature Conference on Global Affairs. My name is Jun-hyung Kim. I'm Chancellor of KNDA. Before we begin the main session of panelists, let me give you a brief introduction and opening remarks. The road toward the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula has been filled with dramatic twists and turns. In 2017, a specter of war loomed, but a surprising turn of events followed in 2018. 5 summits held from 2018 to 2019. 3 inter-Korean summit meetings and the 2 US DPRK summits marked an important milestone. But after the Hanoi failure, whole peace process descended into a prolonged deadlock, impasse. Despite the efforts of concerned countries, the painful reality is that several years of nuclear diplomacy with Pyongyang have failed to yield tangible results. Several new variables have come to the stage this year. The new Biden administration came around and completed its North Korean policy review with positive signals of taking engagement approach. Also, recently the Biden administration has been actively working with its 2 Asian allies, ROK and Japan, to deal with this issue. However, Pyongyang has not shown much reactions and remains in a self-imposed lockdown due mainly to COVID-19. Any possible breakthrough seems out of reach, even out of sight. The intensifying rivalry between the US and China also will likely affect the future trajectory of nuclear negotiations. In the meantime, as the minister just introduced, the surprising good news arrived yesterday. 2 Koreas agreed to reconnect the communication lines, which was cut in 14 months ago. 2 Koreas agreed. It is a good news, but it seems not an outcome of negotiation among concerned parties, rather a starting point we have to utilize. Against this backdrop, IFANS is holding an annual signature conference on global affairs under the theme of breaking the nuclear impasse. Even if we are holding this conference on the web in a consecutive year due to ongoing pandemic situation, its timeliness and the significance cannot be discounted. First session title is Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and Peace in Asia. And to answer that question, we have the best lineup of a panelist from the US, Japan, China, and here in Korea. Eminent scholars and experts will put their heads together to figure out the tasks and the policy options that might help solve nuclear conundrum. 5 presenters will focus on the pre-distributed questions as follows. Let me briefly read this. Why did North Korean nuclear talks end with the impasse? Is it attributable to North Korea's lack of will to denuclearize itself, or to differences in preferred approaches between Washington and Pyongyang? Where is the US-China relation heading toward? Will their competition stymie the nuclear negotiation? And what is the best approach to solving the North Korean nuclear problem? Are sanctions working to change the course of North Korean action? How should the ROK-US alliance be upgraded to deal with North Korea and the regional stability? And finally, what role should China and Japan play to deal with the problem? I'm not saying that all 5 presenters have to cover all the questions, but these are the questions categorized, and we want to focus on this session. And again, I'm the moderator of this session, and I'm honored to be a moderator with this eminent scholars and experts. First, let me introduce Mr. John Hamley. He is the president of CEO of CSIS since January 2000. Before joining CSIS, he served as a 26th US Deputy Secretary of Defense. Prior to holding that post, he was the Undersecretary of Defense from 1993 to 1997. Good to see you, Mr. Hamney, and floor is yours.
Well, good morning, Chancellor
Okay.
Kim, and thank you. I'm very flattered that you invited me, and I'm very sorry that the COVID pandemic keeps us from being together personally and physically. I really miss visiting Korea, and I look forward to the day when we can do that again. I'll just have a couple of thoughts to begin with. I know we'll engage each other in conversation on your questions, but let me just say a few remarks first. You know, the Biden administration has, it indicated several months back, that it had a policy on North Korea. It said it was not going to be President Obama's policy of strategic patience. It was not going to be Trump's policy of naive engagement. It was going to be something else. I must confess, I'm still not sure that I know what the policy is. I think they've been spared having to be clear about it, because for all practical purposes, North Korea has sanctioned itself. The way it's responded to the pandemic, it has just closed itself off from the world. It had to do that because its health system is so poor that if COVID ever got into North Korea, it would be very catastrophic. And so they've just closed themselves off from the world. And for that reason, the Biden administration hasn't really had to make it a primary focus, for their foreign policy. In any event, the Biden administration's real emphasis is on China. China is not only our global focus, it's our regional focus in Asia. And I personally think that the Biden policy toward China is not yet settled. I don't think it's yet stable, and so it's evolving in the early engagement at senior levels between the two governments. I will say honestly that the headwinds in Washington, the political headwinds in Washington concerning China, are pretty negative. And the Biden administration has not tried to make them more negative, but it's a pretty chilly landscape in Washington, and then that has implications for the denuclearization issue. I say this with respect, and I'm really grateful that Professor Jia is with us today. but I don't think that China is really that interested in the unification of the Korean Peninsula, at least not until the United States is gone from Asia. And as a result, I don't think they're going to lean that hard on North Korea on the nuclear issue. I thought the Trump administration's approach was, to basically ignore short-range missiles and only say that America cared about long-range missiles was catastrophic. Because that basically said to our friends in Korea, our friends in Japan, as long as you don't hit us, we don't care what North Korea does. And that was very damaging. So I think reestablishing a framework of deterrence will be the most important priority for the Biden administration. And I don't think they've got a high, it's not high on the agenda to try to work the denuclearization issue. One last thing, if I may, and then I will stop. Because North Korea has closed itself off to prevent COVID in the country, and because it sealed its borders effectively, it has a great economic crisis. What that's going to do is cause the North Korean government to use even more, illicit means like cyber criminality to raise money. That is only going to really harden American attitudes in a very negative way about North Korea and trying to solve the problem. So I think we do have a real serious issue that will emerge, even though North Korea has chosen to isolate itself, from the world right now. Let me stop there, Chancellor Kim, and I'm very anxious to hear my other colleagues.
Thank you very much, President Hamley. Actually, I forgot to give you you are given 10 minutes for presentation, but your presentation is very short. And if you want, I'll give you more time for discussion coming up.
Thank you.
Okay, and President Hamley talked about evaluate North Korean policy of Obama and Trump. And he had still a reservation to evaluate new Biden administrations. And they're saying they're calibrate approach, but in your opinion, still they are calibrating the approach is not settled yet. And you talked about China's role and North Korean increasing criminal action in cyberspace. And you touched a lot of important issues we can have a discussion over it. And secondly, we have a presenter, Ambassador Mark Lippert, and he's a former U.S. ambassador to ROK. He has a distinguished career in the U.S. government that spanned approximately 2 decades and included a series of senior level positions across multiple agencies. And good to see you, Ambassador, and you are the second presenter. The floor is yours.
All right, Chancellor Kim, thank you for the warm introduction. Good to see everybody in Korea. I'm just disappointed we can't do this in person because it's been way too long since I've been to the Korean Peninsula to see all my friends and enjoy all the great culture and marvels that is the Republic of Korea. I too will not use the 10 minutes, but please feel free to come back at me with follow-up questions and happy to tease out any of the points that I make in terms of going deeper to fulfill the needs here at the conference. And I'm much more interested in getting into a back and forth because I think that the panel is outstanding. And interested to hear other views. What I would say is I agree with much of what John Hamre said, Dr. Hamre said. I think that first, let me just talk about the Biden approach for a second. I would say I have a little more clarity than Dr. Hamre. I think that the Biden approach is a phased approach. They essentially have a model that looks a lot like the end of the Bush administration. It looks a lot like the end of the Obama administration. I would just put a caveat there in that Folks often say that the Obama administration's policy was strategic patience. It actually was not. I said that multiple times on the record during my tenure as ambassador. You can look it up, but what I would say is that, and people also forgot that there was a deal early in the Obama administration, the Leap Day deal. So I think that it's important to reflect accurately the record and use those bases for appropriate comparison. So what the Obama administration and Biden administration, I would argue, and the Bush administration look very similar towards is, again, it's a phased approach. And what do I mean by that? First, I would say that the door to negotiations is open under the current construct. And that was underscored by Deputy Secretary Sherman's recent trip, recent comments in the region. And she said, we need to get into a room with each other. And if the interest on the DPRK side is to get sanctions relief, then they know we need to start going down the road of denuclearization. And that essentially says we are willing to trade some sanctions relief for progress towards denuclearization, and recognizing that it's not a all or nothing. There's not a all lifting of all sanctions up front. There is not a demand that all denuclearization occur at once. To me, this looks like a gradual phased approach spread out over several years. So I think that's my main point here in terms of where the policy direction is. I would also argue there are a few other data points that underscore this policy direction. The appointment of Sung Kim, who really is in a similar role for the third time as North Korean nuclear negotiator, some version of that role that he held under Obama and now with Biden. And what I would say here is that, again, I think that also underscores continuity and approach. What do I think of the approach? I think it's the best choice available at the moment. I would say that there have been 2 to 3 decades of study of this problem. I think that where we are today, given all the realities and the different approaches that have been tried, I think this is about the best you can do under the circumstances. Several of the factors were outlined, I think, very well by Dr. Hamre. I think that the key is here, have a realistic strategy, as the Biden administration put forward and has said, number one. Number two, I think get in relatively good alignment with your ally in Seoul and your ally in Tokyo. And I think especially in Seoul, which I'll speak to, is I think underscored how relatively good alignment between the two sides on the approach. I think that then send a clear signal to the North Koreans that we are very interested in talks. And we've done that through a number of means, including, it sounds like, if you believe press reports, direct outreach to the North Koreans, number one. And number two, again, like I said, appointment of a special envoy such as Sung Kim, and comments from the highest levels of the United States government, including Deputy Secretary Sherman's comments, which I referenced there. So door open to diplomacy, but at the same time, a recognition that sanctions relief will come through negotiations, not unilateral actions designed to entice the North Koreans back to the table. So I think that's where we are at the moment. I think the point that I also want to underscore that Dr. Hamre made in very, very articulate terms is the situation in North Korea in terms of COVID, self-sanctioning, you could say closing down some of the internal markets, also closing down to the rest of the world. And that is, I think, an important variable that does two things. One, I think it injects uncertainty that we have not seen in this situation for a long, long time. You could argue, I think some argue, that we haven't seen a humanitarian situation like this in recent years, and you have to go all the way back to the 90s to find something that could perhaps evolve into a worse situation. And that injects a degree of uncertainty and a new variable into the situation. The other piece that I would say is that there has to be an interest by the North Korean side to talk. And right now, there just does not seem to be much of an interest. And that will bring me to, I think, the final couple of points here in the opening statement, is that by and large, the last 2 decades, plus have been, I think, underscored by the unwillingness by the North Koreans to come to the table. I think the key is finding that catalyst, finding ways that plug into the North Korean motivation to negotiate. But again, I think you can look at a very, very clear track record, and the track record shows two elements. One, an unwillingness to negotiate, and two, if you believe Sid Seiler, who said this on the record, the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea, that the North Koreans over the past several decades have shown one unmitigating factor in their strategic decision making, and that is to acquire nuclear weapons and move in that direction. And they've signaled that publicly time and time again. So I think those are the big drivers here that lead us to impasse. The internal situation, the strategic direction of North Korea, and we need to find a catalyst. Final couple of points, as I said, I think that's where China's role is key. I too share Dr. Hamri's view that I think the Chinese right now do not seem overly interested in getting into negotiations, or at least using the leverage that they have to get the North Koreans back to the table. I'm hoping that this stalemate, this impasse, will factor into decision making in Beijing. And I will say that there have been signs over the past 10 years that give you not an overly optimistic point of view, but at least show, again, signs that it is possible. And the one sign that I point to is the Chinese willingness from 2016 on to undertake sectoral sanctions at the United Nations Security Council. That is an important indicator of willingness to show, to put leverage, and I think get the North Koreans, or at least try to get the North Koreans back to the table. There's the separate issue of sanctions enforcement, which I think is also very key. We can talk about that later. But I do think China at this juncture is important in providing the appropriate catalyst for the North to come back to the table. In closing, one point that the panel was asked to suggest is, what can the US ROK do in the interim? I would put, again, emphasis on what Dr. Hamri said in terms of deterrence. I think the summit between President Biden and Moon Jae-in provides a robust treatment of defense deterrence in really the opening couple of paragraphs. I would invite folks to look there. It is, I think, following through on many of those actions would be important in terms of sharpening the deterrence elements, while again leaving the door wide open to diplomacy, as I said earlier. I think with that, I'm going to stop and return the floor back to my colleagues, and look forward to a very interesting and open discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Ambassador Lippert. You talked about also about evaluation of Biden administration North Korean policy. You give some more good points to them than President Hamri, and it's the best choice available at this moment under these circumstances. And also, you talked about, you brought up the issues, uncertainty in North Korea. Maybe we can ask what kind of crisis can you think of this from this situation, and do you have a same line with if pushing more or wait more, North Korea's possibility to collapse? And then you also talked about the unwillingness of North Korean regime to denuclearize, and also China's role in the key. You brought the many issues that we can discuss later. And third presenter is from Japan, and Mr. Kanehara, who is served as Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from 2012 to 2019. In 2013, Mr. Kanehara also became the inaugural Deputy Secretary General of the National Security Secretariat, a role which he held until his retirement from government service in 2019. He also served as Deputy Director of the Cabinet Intelligence and the Research Office. And floor is yours, Mr. Kanehara.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Thank you very much for having me. Let me start with my Japanese perspective, the non-nuclear power state, non-nuclear weapon states and Arab United States in the region. Japan abandons, or Japan has from the beginning, no ambition of having nuclear weapons. And American allies, the South Korea abandoned nuclear ambition, and Taiwan also abandoned nuclear ambition. And United States nuclear policy towards allies is that the US can provide nuclear umbrella. So all the allies must accede to NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. We agreed to that. And we believe that American nuclear umbrella could prevent us from the nuclear disaster. And we believe that even Cold War time, Americans and Russians would never shoot against each other nuclear weapons. China was on our side during the Cold War. Even today, we don't believe that the major responsible nuclear powers will not shoot each other the strategic nuclear weapons. This is not the case of North Korea. North Korean supreme interest could be very different from ours. Their supreme interest could be a tactical interest for us. They might be tempted to use nuclear weapons. And this is a real issue now. And can we truly guarantee our security with American nuclear umbrella? We never talked about seriously the nuclear strategy here in Asia. Nuclear strategy of the United States is heavily Eurocentric. And because China is with us during the Cold War, we don't fear Russian nuclear attack very seriously. But North Korean nuclear weapons, we must consider that seriously. We have to tailor-made our nuclear strategy here in the region, together with the United States and together with South Korea, and we have to be transparent vis-a-vis China and Russia. And to tailor-made, to make our strategy, nuclear strategy tailor-made, we have to start discussions now. And it must be in the framework of strengthening American deterrence, in the framework of Japan-US alliance and ROC-US alliance. We have to enhance the deterring power capabilities of the alliance. That is the way to go. Because I'm now no longer in the government, I'm writing papers, and I joined the Chicago Global Affairs Council team and published their declarations or recommendations. So there, the council said that the NATO-type nuclear sharing must be seriously considered to enhance the deterring power in Northeast Asia. For that purpose, the strategic talks must be started. I fully agree with that. The negotiations with North Korea must be proceeded. But I have to say, before having nuclear weapons, it was much easier. We could do quid pro quo, tit for tat. If you stop that, we can give you that. If you abandon Yongbyon, we can give you that. Now they have nuclear weapons. Our first question must be, where are your nukes? Where did you make them? Where do you preserve them? Are you ready to truly abandon it? It's not COVID, it's CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of weapons. Are you strategically ready to do that? This must be the first question. They'll never say yes. As far as they are not committed, the North Koreans have only one strength vis-a-vis us because they don't have elections. We do have elections. They can buy time negotiating 2-3 years, and they say, bye-bye, Mr. Biden, bye-bye, Mr. Suga, bye-bye, Mr. Moon. They can repeat again the same process. This is exactly what we did many times. We can do this again. As far as they have nuclear weapons, we can no longer engage ourselves in tit for tat and quid pro quo, except for some humanitarian assistance to them. And to resolve this issue, absolutely, we need Chinese help. China is pivotal in our efforts. And we do agree, all the surrounding nations, the Peninsula and the South Korea too, we do agree that the nuclear-free Peninsula is the interest of everybody. Non-proliferation must be preserved in Northeast Asia. That is everybody's interest. Underneath this surface, geopolitical interests are very different. China wants to keep influence in North Korea, of course. China had been the most influential power in Asia, in the Peninsula. They withdrew simply in the beginning of 20th century. They are back again after Korean War. North Korea is very close to China, Beijing. And North Korea must be on Chinese orbit strictly. That must be Chinese geopolitical interests. And then how can we accommodate Chinese interests to realize nuclear-free Peninsula we have to have a straightforward talk here. If China believes that the status quo is fine, then we have to live with North Korean nuclear weapons. Then we have to be ready to enhance our deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea. And this is where we are. And this is a moment. And the North Korea is now suffering from COVID. Sorry for them. Sorry for the people. Could be a chance for us to open talks with them. And in that case, the major powers, in particular, United States and China, and then Japan, South Korea, of course, and could be Russia, should agree on not only on non-proliferation level, but also on geopolitical interest level. And this is the only way to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kanehara. I could feel your, frustration and the fear of national security caused by North Korea, and you stressed cooperation of concerned countries and the firm line against North Korea's nuclear development. Your points is, I think, were taken. And we have the last but not least, sorry, we have two more panelists. From China at this time, the first presenter is Mr. Jia Qingguo, is a member of the Standing Committee of 11th, 12th, and 13th National Committee of Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and has been elected in March 2013 as a member of the Committee of Foreign Affairs of 13th CPPCC. Dr. Jia Qingguo, you're the next presenter. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Chancellor Kim, and thank you for your invitation. It's great to talk with my distinguished colleagues and friends. It's a great pity that we cannot sit together in person to talk about this issue, this complicated and sensitive issue. Yeah, I sense a lot of pessimism. Actually, I'm also quite pessimistic about North Korean denuclearization at this moment. Despite the change in the White House earlier this year, the chance for North Korea denuclearization is more remote than ever. North Korea appears to be determined to keep its nuclear weapons under whatever circumstances. In December 2019, in the wake of the failure of the King-Trump summits, North Korea reversed its previous decision on prioritizing economic development. Now, it reprioritized nuclear weapons on the par with economic development. So it's parallel now. The US has shown little resolve in addressing North Korea nuclear problem. It still wants North Korea denuclearization. However, so far, it has not made it a foreign policy priority and has shown little willingness to devote too much resources to deal with it. It doesn't need China's help, it appears. There is little chance for more international collaboration to pressure North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. The main stakeholders have not met to discuss ways and means to persuade North Korea to give up nuclear weapons for a number of years. China and North Korea just celebrated the 60th anniversary of their Mutual Defense Pact. China and Russia are publicly calling for lifting some sanctions to reward North Korea for refraining from conducting fresh nuclear tests. How do we explain this development? I think several factors are important. First is the US hostile policy toward China. This has complicated international efforts at North Korea denuclearization. The US adopted a hostile policy toward China during the Trump administration. For various reasons, the Biden administration has largely inherited this approach. It has regarded China as the ideological, economic, and military threat to the US. It has engaged in demonizing China, maintaining high tariffs on Chinese exports to the US imposed during the Trump administration, restricting high-tech trade and investment with China, challenging China's claims in South China Sea and East China Sea, imposing various sanctions on Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and also undermining China's sovereignty over Taiwan. The US approach to China has eroded, has several implications. First, has eroded China's domestic support for cooperation with the US to put pressures on North Korea denuclearization. More and more Chinese regard the US as a hostile country. Accordingly, they believe that China should not help the US on any issue, including the North Korean nuclear problem. In addition, the US approach to China has undermined multilateral cooperation to persuade North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. Without strong endorsement from China and Russia, the stakeholders cannot come up with sufficient pressures and inducements to persuade North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. In fact, China and Russia, as I just mentioned, are pushing for reduction of existing UN sanctions on North Korea. Finally, the US approach toward China has strengthened North Korea's determination to hold on to its nuclear weapons. North Korea sees deterioration of relations between China and the US as a golden opportunity to keep its nuclear weapons. Accordingly, it has toughened its rhetoric and refused to negotiate a deal under whatever circumstances. Second, the US is largely in an inward-looking mode. Despite the Biden win in the presidential election, the political infighting in the US continues and intensifies. Confronted with an uncooperative Republican Party, the Biden administration has to devote most of its time and energy, as well as resources, to get anything done at home. Whether it's securing Senate approval of nomination of cabinet officials or congressional endorsement of bills to fight the pandemic, revive the economy, or rebuild infrastructure. On top of that, it needs to fight against efforts of Trump and his associates to make a comeback in future elections by changing the voting regulations. Under the circumstances, except for confronting China, the US has shown little interest to commit much on foreign policy issues. Thirdly, it is increasingly clear that US foreign policy priority, as Mr. Hamry just mentioned, is to counter the perceived China threat rather than addressing various foreign policy issues, including the North Korean nuclear problem. To the Biden administration, China poses an unprecedented threat to the US. The Soviet threat during the Cold War was largely a military one. The Japanese threat in the 1980s was largely an economic one. The China threat is both, as well as others. Therefore, the Biden administration has found it imperative to address the so-called China threat and rally whatever international support it can get for that purpose. So on foreign policy, it spends most of its resources on containing China. Under the circumstances, the Biden administration is unwilling to make any compromise with China in order to secure its support to persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. Finally, confronted with the Biden administration's hostile approach toward China, China is losing hope for reconciliation with the US. When Biden came in, the Chinese leaders sent out messages to the effect that it's willing to work with the Biden administration to stabilize China-US relations. But these messages were largely ignored. Chinese believe that what Biden administration wants from China is similar to that of Trump. That is not just money, but also life. In other words, not just concessions from China, but also total surrender of China, which is unacceptable. Therefore, it is trying to brace itself, or China is trying to brace itself for more conflicts and confrontation. Under the circumstances, the last thing it wishes to do is to help to address concerns of the US, including the North Korea nuclear problem. What about the future? I think the available evidence suggests that there is not much to be optimistic about the future resolution of the North Korean nuclear problem at the moment. First, the US-China policy is unlikely to change in a substantive way in the foreseeable future. Secondly, confronted with a perceived hostile approach toward China, China is unlikely to cooperate with the Biden administration on international issues, including the North Korean denuclearization. Thirdly, without China's support and cooperation, the chance for multilateral cooperation on North Korea nuclear issue remains very small. China is not going to work with the US to put additional pressures on North Korea again, given the current background of US-China policy. Finally, under the circumstances, North Korea is unlikely to give up its nuclear weapons. To North Korea, as long as China and the US are opposed to each other, it will get China's support, whatever it does. That including keeping its nuclear weapons. Since it regards nuclear weapons essential to its security, it's unlikely to bow to outside pressures. So what does all this mean for North Korea nuclear problem and Northeast Asia peace and stability? It appears that a stalemate on North Korea nuclear problem is likely to continue, and Northeast Asia needs to brace itself for more instability and challenges in the foreseeable future. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jia-Chi Guo. Audience can notice that compared with the three presenters before Professor Jia-Chi Guo, he presented much different opinions. And his point is, the failure at the Hanoi 2019 is partially as a U.S. Responsibility, and also demonizing China and ever worsening relationship between China and US actually made North Korea holding on the nuclear weapons more because it's strategically more valuable. And also because of all the domestic problems that US faces, and especially by demonizing again China through and try to tackle these issues. So that makes complicated now. And that's why even US wants to help from China and cooperation with China, those issues including North Korean denuclearizations. So China is not going to help the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. The different opinions, that means that this can be followed by the hot debate. So I'll give you panelists to respond, other panelists after the last, but not the least presenters. Mr. Hwang Il-do is assistant professor at KNDA. He's renowned North Korean expert in Korea. He wrote many articles and books about North Korean weapons of mass destruction and countermeasures of South Korea and the US. Dr. Hwang, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you for having me this wonderful table. Actually, I'm a kind of newbie on this table, and then it's quite an honor to shake to share my little take with this prominent, most honorable guest here on this table. So let me start in this way. Does North Korea have the will to denuclearize? In fact, I don't think this is an accurate question. This is because it depends on what direction North Korea wants to go in the long term. The question of whether sanctions are effective or whether the goal of denuclearization can be achieved through the continuation of sanctions would also be the same. The premise I have is that Pyongyang's goals are not permanent. Rather, it has undergone a lot of changes depending on the circumstances and timing, and I think it may be the same in the future. Traditionally, Pyongyang attaches great importance to maintaining multiple options. They have applied these options flexibly according to the change of circumstances and have changed their external behavior accordingly. In the big picture, I believe that North Korea's calculus on nuclear negotiations is related to their economic strategy. The first option is a strategy that creates a basis for maintaining or developing the economy at least at minimum level by partially yielding nuclear capabilities and receiving partial sanctions relief in nuclear negotiations. First, it can be similar to the case of the Cuba in the 1990s when the Cold War ended. The second option is complete self-reliance, a model of permanent independent survival by solving the food problem indigenously and reducing external dependence on major industrial resources, probably similar to the 1960s Kim Il-sung model. Officially, North Korea has always been the latter, but the diplomatic endeavors in 2018 showed that the former was also considered as one of the options. This probably means that Pyongyang has been also not convinced of probability of their self-reliance model. If the first option is to improve the current situation, the second option is to maintain the status quo. In other words, it's a choice between development or survival. The young leader, Kim Jong-un, must have wanted to develop somehow rather than the path of barely surviving in the future. I think that was the main reason why North Korea entered into nuclear negotiation in 2018. During this time, the North Korean state media repeatedly used the expression that they were making diplomatic endeavors in order to create favorable external conditions for economic development. However, after the failure of the Hanoi summit, Pyongyang is clearly returning to the self-reliance line or the Kim Il-sung model. Then the question is whether these models are sustainable and whether it is possible to survive the sanctions. In other words, the question of whose side is time on. If Pyongyang thinks so, it is too difficult to avoid the prolonged North Korean nuclear saga, and there is no doubt that Pyongyang is considering the variable of US-China competition in this regard. Due to the recent food situation and instability of market prices, speculations about North Korean crisis have reappeared within the NK Watchers community, fundamentally based on the premise that self-reliance will not succeed. However, Pyongyang is likely to think differently. 슬라이드 좀 띄워주시겠어요? So this is the market price of the rice in North Korea on the private market. So first of all, it should be pointed out that the North Korea's recent difficulties are mostly the result of border closures in response to the pandemic. Even after the current sanctions regime was completed at the end of 2017, before the pandemic, Pyongyang did not experience serious difficulty in food or market prices. Apparently, you can see the fluctuation began in the early 2020. 다음 슬라이드 보여주세요.
Next slide, please.
However, in order to prevent the deterioration of the quality of life of the populations, they maintained the imports of consumer goods and trade deficit has accumulated because of this kind of the whole gap between export and import, which means there must have been a concern that the foreign currency reserve would be depleted in the long run. The recent economic difficulties are clearly due to the border closure, but at the same time, border closure or suspension of imports has the positive effect, ironically, of slowing down the depletion of hard currency for them. Moreover, Pyongyang is attempting to turn the current situation of trade blockades into an opportunity to reduce external dependence and strengthen control over the national economy as a whole. Since the 1990s, trading companies under powerful agencies such as the military have been independently engaged in trade and profit activities, and related data or quantity have not been properly reported to the central government. Pyongyang's latest move is to correct these past behaviors. As such, it seems clear that they are trying to reduce the dependence of the official economy on external factors and minimize the dependence of state-owned enterprises on the informal sector of economy. This is an attempt to revise the policy direction since the 1990s, which maintained the productivity through a hybrid of the formal and informal economy. In other words, to increase the durability of the economic system that can withstand prolonged sanctions. If this work pays off to some extent, Pyongyang will be able to calculate that it can survive with nuclear weapons. For example, if they soon face serious difficulties in the food situation, etc., they may think that stabilization is possible at any time by lifting the border closure and returning to the situation by 2019. Necessary goods such as food and fertilizer are not subject to international sanctions, so trade or support for these items is possible according to the decision of neighboring countries such as China. From Beijing's point of view, it is well known that North Korea's domestic political instability is as bad or worse than North Korea's nuclear possession. Moreover, as the US-China competition intensifies, it will become easier to obtain the support necessary for survival from China, they may believe. Recently, North Korean state media has emphasized the 1960s as a kind of campaign reference case, and it was the time when Kim Il-sung first proposed the self-reliance model. Even at that time, Pyongyang tried to reduce its dependence on external sources as much as possible through the localization of major materials, and the shortage was procured through China and Soviet Union using the international political environment of the Cold War. Therefore, it seems that they are still calculating that necessary conditions for survival can be derived from China by using this US-China competition. And this is probably the background for the recent strengthening of North Korea and China relations. Even in this case, however, they will not completely collapse the table of conversation with the United States, as they believe it is necessary to leave a hatching card for negotiations with the United States in order to maximize its strategic value to China. As well known, North Korea has long been concerned about unilateral dependence on China. Further, in a situation where there's no hope for economic improvement, grievances among North Korean people can accumulate, which might increase the political instability. Even to manage this, the negotiation table with the United States cannot be completely ignored. For this reason, I believe that the key word for resuming the North Korean nuclear negotiation are still economic issues or sanction issues. Of course, Pyongyang repeatedly raised the security issues that are summarized in the withdrawal of the US hostile policy so-called. However, Pyongyang's position on how security can be guaranteed has been changing on, and it is very difficult even to think about how it can be guaranteed in practice. Rather, I think that emphasizing security issues is a rhetoric they use when they think it is not the right time to negotiate. Likewise, issues such as the ROK-US joint exercise, the USFK, and ROK-US alliance are issues that China is also very sensitive to. Pyongyang has shown a pattern of further emphasizing these remarks at a time when relationship with China need to be strengthened. In this vein, the first task to resolve the deadlock in the nuclear negotiations is to turn North Korea's long-term economic strategy, which has taken a step backwards to the 1960s, back to the first option of 2018. And for this, the starting point is to elaborate the initial formula of the exchange between the initial denuclearization measures and the corresponding sanction-related measures. For example, a method of exchanging partial sanction relief for the Yongbyon or Yongbyon plus alpha model. Of course, it is not easy, and various opinions cannot be avoided about what cards can be given without fundamentally undermining the integrity of the sanction regime, or what is an appropriate price or level of partial release. In any case, I believe that how to formulate this formula is the key to negotiating the North Korean nuclear problem for now. At the Korea-US summit in May, the Biden administration and Moon administration agreed on the basic principles of the nuclear negotiation. Therefore, it can be said that the relevant countries are now going into the second phase of policy coordination. And I guess that from now on, we should focus on how to devise out the initial formula in detail. Oliver Pierre, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huang. Talked about provided a little different opinion about crisis situation or economic difficulties inside North Korea. It's more like, by his argument, it's more like self-imposed difficulties. So if they need, they can lift the close down and lockdown, and they can be back to, even if it's not enough, they can survive. Talked about. I'm curious about the response from Ambassador Lippert later on. And second point he made, it was, North Korea is trying to utilize U.S.-China strategic rivalries and the modeling through by utilizing that's possible. And another point is very interesting point is, North Korea has been asking the security guarantee exchange with the denuclearization, not the economic relief of economic sanctions, especially after Hanoi. But he said it's rhetoric. What really they want is actually economic sanction relief. So I'm curious about the response from other panelists. We have about 15 minutes left, and we are having, questions from audience, even though we cannot cover every questions, but I'm going to go there and to read their questions. Before that, why don't we have one more round for discussion? This is discussions. So why do you have each panelist, if you have any response or retort for other panelist arguments, then you can do it. And after that, then I have some specific questions to each speaker. Why don't we go back to President Hamley? I actually have a quite contrasting view from Jiaqing Guo. So any response or any retort you want to do?
Well, thank you. And yes, I do have something that I would like to discuss that that directly reflects on something Professor Jia said, which I think is the core, the absolute core of the issue. And I'm really grateful that he brought it up. I don't think he appreciated quite the way that he did it, but at one point in his comments, he said that leaders in China are really questioning whether they should help the United States with our North Korea nuclear problem. Now, I think that is, America does not really have a North Korea nuclear problem. For 20 years, we've invested in a missile defense system that is good enough to stop North Korean missiles for a period of about 30 minutes until our ICBMs will return and completely destroy North Korea. So we don't really have a North Korea nuclear problem. The countries that have a nuclear problem with North Korea, it's South Korea, it's Japan, and it's China. Now, we do have a solemn obligation, and my dear friend Kanahara-san pointed this out. We have a very strong obligation because we do have a problem in this sense. We are obligated to defend Korea and Japan against nuclear attack. And right now, the only way we can do that, because our missile defense system won't protect them, The only way we can do that is with deterrence. So if China thinks that they're helping us by staying away from North Korea's nuclear issue, the only thing that does is drive the United States, Korea, and Japan closer together. So China does not enjoy the luxury of saying it does not have a North Korea problem. We all have a North Korea problem. We all have a North Korea nuclear problem. And the more that North Korea builds its nuclear weapons, the more it brings the United States, Japan, and Korea closer together for mutual defense. So I just think that's the crucial issue that we have to understand in this conversation. As to Professor Jia's comments about the deterioration of relations between China and the United States, I think it's very unfortunate. I agree with him. I think it's very unfortunate that we have this happening. And it's on both sides, but we really do need to step in and try to get to a more constructive framework going forward, in my view. Thank you for giving me the chance, Chancellor Kim.
Let me give you an additional questions. Actually, the three areas Biden administration brought up that can be, have a cooperation with China is, climate change and pandemic and non-proliferation, including North Korean issues. And that means, this North Korean issue can be an area that can lead to cooperation between these two struggling two superpowers. But all panelists have a negative prospect over this. If we go back to the Obama administration, actually, they pushed China to use leverage and pressuring North Korea, but it didn't work. And the Trump administration, actually, they passing China, but later on blame China as an obstructionist. And now, at least, Biden asked some help from China for the denuclearizations. Yes, you said it's a critical issue for China too, but do you think this kind of stance can help have some kind of a positive cooperation between these two countries?
Well, look, I don't think China will do anything on North Korea as a favor to the United States. And we're not going to do anything as a favor to China. I mean, we do it because both of our countries, respectively, in our own interest, decide that it's a problem we have to work on together. It isn't something we're doing as a favor. So, it is in China's interest that North Korea not further its nuclear program. It is in our interest that North Korea not expand its nuclear program. That is in Japan's interest, South Korea's interest. All four of us, I should say, share a very strong interest in finding a solution to the North Korea problem. And it isn't because they're doing a favor to us. It's because it's important and it's good for China. So there is a basis for cooperation. There is a basis for cooperation. We need to start with that.
There is some argument, maybe wishful thinking, that in Korea, because China is going to hold the next Olympic, Winter Olympics, it's not like a repeat of Pyeongchang Olympic that started, peace process. But China, what if China tried to show them it's not really peace broker like the U.S. claim? So they tried to be a peacemaker, at least for the time being. So this time is not rather not be a obstructionist in the peace process. What do you think about that?
I think I'd like to hear Professor Jia's comment about that. I think we should just think about this in concrete, hard national interests. I don't think if it's an opportunity to use the Olympics to open a door, that's great. But I don't think there's romanticism about this issue. I think it's hard national interests.
Okay, why don't they then us go to Professor Jia? can you respond? And then any
Sure.
other things you want to comment?
Sure, thank you. Actually, I agree with Mr. Hammery that it's in China's interest to have North Korea denuclearization. And also China should work together with other countries, including the United States, to pressure and induce and persuade North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. However, the reality on the ground is the U.S. policy toward China is so hostile that the people in China, many people in China, do not think along this line. They believe it's a U.S. problem. Actually, a lot of people used to believe that. Now more people believe that because it's North Korea, our friend, who has nuclear weapons. It's like for the U.S., it's Israel who has nuclear weapons. So it's acceptable. And also because of the U.S. approach toward China appears to be taking China's stakes away from the existing international order. Remember Bob Zoellick used to say, China is a stakeholder of the international system, so it should work together more closely with other countries to take up responsibilities. But now, since the Trump administration, the U.S. government has regarded China as a sort of a outlier. When the Biden administration, when they talk about North Korea issues, they talk with Japan, with South Korea, but not with China. So China and not just on North Korea, but on many other issues, they're not consulting with China anymore. Okay? So why should China think maintaining international order is in China's interest? So a lot of people in China begin to think that, okay, the system's yours, not mine. Why should I take care? Why should I make efforts to help protect it? Non-proliferation regime is yours. It's not ours. Because we are not even consulted with. China has gotten a lot of blames for the Chinese quite exaggerate unfounded excuses. Like the Xinjiang that is called a genocide. I just came back from Xinjiang. If you use the genocide too liberally, as a human rights violation would be considered as a genocide, then China can if China uses the same criteria to talk about the US, then China can say the US is practicing genocide because you put a lot of colored people in prison than the whites. So we should not practice this we should not use this term too liberally. So China feels that we should probably be take a break and try to recalibrate our interests and our aspirations, and then talk to each other in real terms and seriously, and then we can deal with sort out of our common. We have a lot of shared common interests, a lot of stakes in this world. If we can sit down and talk to each other seriously, then I think China and the US has a lot to work on, including the North Korean nuclear issue.
Okay, let me give you follow-up questions. I know you have a lot of issues you want to talk about between the two superpowers, but I want to go back to the issues that even though China's role is and the strategic competition between you two countries is important, but let's go back to their influence over this North Korean denuclearization issues. So even if Professor Jia, even if Biden has some, suggestion or offer some cooperation and some need help from China over denuclearization North Korea, you don't believe that, or you think it's the same as like Obama, that as I explained, they're just pushing China to pressure North Korea. There's no difference between them. Or one of the questions from the audience says same thing. Is the Beijing, Winter Olympic cannot be a opportunity to change this, or you don't agree because you gave us very negative prospect over cooperation between US and China?
Well, China certainly hopes that we will have denuclearization. It's in China's interest. China certainly hopes that the North Korea and South Korea can talk to each other. Stability is also of the peninsula is also in China's interest. If there is a chance, China certainly would like to help promote such kind of a dialogue. But at the same time, as I said, somehow China and the US have to find a way to be serious about their relationship, to be pragmatic in seeking for solutions. If China-US relationship continues like this, I think North Korea denuclearization will be seriously affected in a negative way.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me go back to Ambassador Lippert. Do you have anything to comment on anything? And then I'll follow, give a follow-up questions. Yeah, go ahead.
A couple of comments. First, I think the moderator is wise to reframe this. I think a U.S.-China relationship panel is interesting, but it's not the principal topic at hand. In that context, I would have lots of rebutting to do, but I will forego those with the reservation that if this was a panel about another topic, I would dive deeper into those issues. I would say the other reason you're wise to reframe this is that US-China is not the principal driver of DPRK, denuclearization, right? Even when the relation between Washington and Beijing is good, the DPRK strategic direction has been largely unchanged over the past 2 decades. And I think that's an important factor. I think one underlying issue that underscores that it's the U.S.-China relationship where the Chinese position is not the principal driver, but it's an important factor, is that even when U.S.-China relations are good, as in addition to the DPRK position generally being unchanged, China has shown very little willingness to forgo realpolitik interests on the Korean Peninsula in pursuit of these global obligations, right? NPT, the non-proliferation regime. I think you heard Jia Jingguo get into some of that, right? Talking about how, why should the Chinese citizens sign up for this regime, right? Well, the answer is it's a global regime of which the Chinese government has committed to, right? But by and large, you've seen when push comes to shove and there's a prioritization in Beijing, Beijing has consistently put realpolitik interests on the Korean Peninsula ahead of these global pursuits, and I think that's an important factor. The other quick piece that I would say is that I think that even in the darkest days of the US-Soviet relationship, which I'm not comparing here necessarily, but what I am saying is that we did find a way to work together on nonproliferation issues, on issues of nuclear concern. And I think that's exactly why the Biden administration has opened the door for cooperation with Beijing on these types of issues. Last couple of points I would just say, I do think the US has made this a priority over time. I was a little confused by those comments. I think looking back at President Obama, early on, he engaged in diplomacy on the nuclear weapons issue, on the DPRK Leap Day deal. He called it the most important issue when he was handing over his office, so to speak, to President Trump. President Trump, I think it was a flawed process, but definitely put American credibility on the line and agreed to an unprecedented set of summits. So I think there is no shortage of importance on the issue. And let me just close in terms of saying I was a little confused too by the comments by Jia Jingguo. On the one hand, he said the U.S. doesn't need Chinese help. On the other hand, he said we can't move forward without it. I do think Chinese help is really important here. I do think that they are an important part of the puzzle. I think they are critical to this. I do think that them coming together in a multilateral forum to uphold global obligations around nonproliferation, things that the United Nations Security Council is an important element in producing the environment in which the North Koreans can and should come to the table. Final point, Chancellor, get off the stage, as you asked a question earlier to me about Ebola in North Korea. I think it's a very interesting topic. I just want to be clear. I don't believe that regime collapse is imminent. I want to be careful and be very clear on that point. But I do think it is interesting, the comments about self-imposed sanctions, so to speak, or self-imposed isolation. I think that is exactly right. What I do think is interesting is what is the driver of that? And we have seen the North Korean regime be very concerned about global health issues. For example, in 2015 on Ebola, which was a remote threat at best to North Korea, a quarantine and shutdown of borders in response to the Ebola crisis in some ways. And I think you see that type of decision making around global health issues unfolding here. So I do agree it is in their power to reopen up, to re-engage with the rest of the world. However, I think they are showing a desire or a willingness to make great sacrifices to their own economic situation in response to this. And that, I think, decision-making process is of great interest. And that is what I'm talking about in terms of a very, I think, a new variable, and again, a somewhat remarkable variable that I think is worthy of further discussion and exploration. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me give another question. Actually, this question and the question from the audience that will is reflected. What do you think about this Biden's administration North Korean policy? And right after the U.S. ROK summit, and U.S. said the ball is in North Korea's court. And that's very common expression by the US. But that means even though they deny the strategic patience, but even though they didn't want, but the situation can be like the same situation as strategic patience, even though it can be a short period. So, and many panelists pointed out that because so many problems US facing domestically and the China issue. So North Korean issue is important, significant, but not urgent. So that means they're waiting unless North Korea provoke. And do you agree with that, or do you think that's the situation we are facing, or we're in the near future?
Well, I think the issue is that the North Korean side is not willing to talk and come to the table at this point, and that's the driver here. And I think if someone can figure that out, I think there is great flexibility and pragmatism on the Biden administration to get into talks. I think that's an important thing. What they will not do is start removing sanctions before the North comes to the table, right? I think that as you saw Deputy Secretary Sherman's comments, she's interested in clearly a phased approach, a back and forth negotiation. And I would say reading into that, it feels like that you would have gradual sanctions relief for gradual denuclearization. That's my read on it. I would say that the other point to underscore, I think, the Biden administration's pragmatism is that they've put forward clear signals, right? You've said, okay, here's a special negotiator, Sung Kim, available, will engage in talks anytime, right? So that's point one. The second point is, I think Secretary Sherman's trip, as I just mentioned, she puts positive signals out in terms of willingness to get into dialogue with the North Koreans. And the third thing I would just say to underscore the pragmatism is that despite, I think, a lot of concerns voiced by the expert community in Washington around the Trump summits, around that type of diplomacy, there is a clear embrace of those summits, or at least the foundations on which the foreign minister just outlined in the joint statement between President Biden and President Moon. And I think that was a signal to one, working together with allies in the importance there in terms of the ROK, but more broadly, pragmatism in the approach. So I wouldn't say it's a wait and see attitude. I wouldn't say it's not an unimportant attitude. I would say they're sending all the right signals, ranging from direct outcome or direct talks or direct outreach rather to public signals. They've indicated a flexible approach. They've indicated they're open to diplomacy, and that they've also indicated a pragmatic approach. So I think that's about as good as you can do, but you do need the other side to come to the table and start talking. It takes two to talk in this case. And then I think, as I said earlier, I'll end here, a commitment to the multilateral piece, right? It does take the partners, it does take a multilateral approach to ultimately make progress on this, at least according to me. Thanks.
And actually, everybody, North Korea claims that you go first, and then the U.S. says you go first. So do you think it's possible, simultaneous actions? But again, for simultaneous action, that they need to meet. So many people say that simultaneous action is the only way, but the same question we face again, that you come first for negotiating the simultaneous actions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've always felt that if there's political will in Pyongyang to get into a serious negotiation, you can figure out the sequencing, you can figure out the diplomatic measures. I think we've got enough experienced hands in Washington, in Seoul, to work together to figure out the right amount of sequencing or how this would work in terms of the diplomatic structure, which I think is important. But again, I think the primary driver is creating essentially making sure that the North Korean side is willing to come and engage in serious negotiations. Final point on that is, I do think that you've seen the American side try new things under President Trump in terms of, it used to be that you would hear a lot of people say, if you just got the two leaders in the room, we could solve this. Well, the U.S. accepted that argument, got the two leaders in the room, and if you believe some of the firsthand accounts that are out in books, the North walked out. So I think the interest here is the interesting piece here is that I am less concerned or put less emphasis on the ability of the international community, of the US, of Seoul, of others to structure this in the right way. And I put much more emphasis and much more import on the political willingness of the DPRK to come forward. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's turn mic to Mr. Kanehara. You have something to comment before I ask specific question?
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed. Thank you very much for the very frank talks between Mr. Hamre and Professor Cha. This is much more frank than in six-party talks. I have to say that the North Korea is very skillful in handling two big powers in this way. Moscow, Beijing, they survived in this way. Now Russia is out from the game. Now they're handling the Washington and Beijing this way. And the competition, great power competition between Washington and Beijing, this is nothing to do with North Korea. It goes with its own momentum. And North must be using this to their advantage. We have to bear that in our minds. It's a reality. And second point is, then we have to cope with it. North Korean nuclear threat is real, and South Korea is no longer, of course, nuclear power. They abandoned all the programs, but they are enhancing their military capabilities. They are in the right direction. The South Korean military budget is now as big as Japanese one, $50 billion, 2.7% of GDP. We are still struggling to catch up with 1% of GDP, a bit slow. And the South Korean missiles are 800 kilometers. It's in the intermediate range. And it's coming up with a big fleet that the South Korea is becoming a true naval power. And we have to catch up with the South Koreans too. And we have to strengthen our deterrence in the region. And for that purpose, was first of all, Beijing, Washington's rapprochement is necessary, but it's not seems possible today. Then the Washington, Tokyo, Seoul must be cooperates. And when we become stronger, that would pressure upon Pyongyang, and that could induce them to talk to us. If we go in this way, just go, we're going, North Korea will never take seriously our protests, and they will go on with their own nuclear programs. We have to catch up with them. We have to cope with them. Stronger, robust stance. Thank you.
Yeah, let me ask one question. Sometimes extreme realism and extreme idealism can hinder, pragmatic solution. Even, in terms of this pragmatic approach, declared by Biden, you talked about the CVID. I understand the CVID, how important to Japan, and you say you blamed because it's not firm enough. That's why we failed somehow. But sometimes some people argue that CVID is more like a myth. So complete verification, yeah, its ultimate goal is okay. But if you put CVID on the front, as a condition, that's very not programmatic. And another extreme argument, came from these, rising these days is North Korea is not going to denuclearize at all. So they're not gonna give up. So that's too much realism. So what can we do? So in between, I think it's more desirable to approach it programmatically. And then you talked about the pragmatic approach too, and Biden. So what do you think about this CVID? I know it's important. Can you put a little more and on the back as a ultimate goal? So, but it seems like to us, Japan is always put this as a condition, precondition.
The CVID is the objective that we can never abandon. We can never accept the nuclear weapon status to North Korea. Then we are surrender to them. We cannot accept it. Problem is, as I said, our weakness is that we are democracies. We have elections. Regularly, our leaders change. Our teams change. So we are given simply several years to negotiate with them. And they are very good negotiators. They're always taking advantage of our rivalries and different interests, and they buy time. And they get something. And they say bye-bye. And then we start this again. And meantime, they develop their nuclear weapons. So at least we have to hear from them that final goal is the same with us, to save it. But to achieve that goal, they start negotiating again. But here, we have to make it clear that we are not negotiating with, say, Iran. Iran has not yet possessed nuclear weapons. So to keep them non-nuclear power, we're negotiating with them, lifting sanctions, these things. It's very difficult with the new leader in Tehran. North Korea has nuclear weapons. We can't accept it. As far as they have nuclear weapons, the room for negotiations is quite limited. Otherwise, they get something from us, and several years later, they say bye-bye. And this cannot be repeated. We did this failure many times. We cannot do this again. Okay.
Okay, and one more question actually for you is, you stressed importance of cooperation of concerned country, and I totally agree with it. And I cannot get away from this question, very sensitive question, relation between ROK and Japan. Some people are criticizing, we actually tied this question like other issues. But these days, Japan is the one who connected and tied the history and all the issues with this denuclearization, or at least a dialogue between the two countries. So somehow preconditioned that South Korea surrender first to have a serious talk, with those conditions. But our position is, as far as I know, why don't we talk first and then do whatever it takes? But at least by this moment, Japanese government is very firm that it's always the condition. This. What do you think about that?
You have to know that for Japan,
So again, domestic audience.
for Japan, the stable, prosperous, strong Korean Peninsula is our national interest. It's only when Korean Peninsula is weak and confused that continental powers becomes a threat to us. It was the case of Yuan, Mongols, they invaded us twice. And to keep Korean Peninsula peaceful, stable, prosperous, stronger, that's our national interests. And you have to know that when the Japanese Empire imploded, Americans came in, we agreed with them to help Americans to defend Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. And we started to expand our assistance to the United States in 1990s. We told them we can help them in non-combat operations. Prime Minister Abe even said we changed the constitutional interpretation. We can even help Americans in combat operations for you. It's not for us. We are trying to be good relationship with South Korea. And of course, there are issues between us always. We have to overcome it. And we are helping you. You're not helping us. This is the reality. And we have to think seriously about the strategic cooperation. As I say this twice, the strong, prosperous, stable, peaceful Korea is the best interest of Japan. We want to pursue that, okay?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kanehara. The last presenter, Dr. Huang, do you have any additional comment before I ask specific question?
Okay, actually, unfortunately, my comment is also going to the Professor Jia. So actually, the status quo is not just standing still in this case, it is getting worsening. So actually, North Korea, even at this moment, North Korea is expanding their nuclear arsenal. And in the beginning of this year, they declared they will go to the tactical nuclear weapon development and the nuclear warfighting kind of the doctrine. So, well, I don't think they can undermine the overwhelming supremacy of U.S. side, even if they go to the tactical nuclear weapons. But anyway, the nuclear stability or strategic stability of the region in the region will be seriously damaged in that case. As you can see, that this doctrinal change might invite U.S. low-yield nuclear weapons into the region, and the nuclear threshold on this part of the world will be seriously more lowered. I mean, in that case, maybe the strategic stability calculation between the United States and China can be also changed. And in that case, maybe there should be some sort of the nuclear arms race between two countries. I mean, the status quo, leaving the status quo of the North Korean nuclear problem, even can make the US DPRK strategic competition more serious, more severe into the nuclear arms race dimension. So, and I'm quite sure that China is the most aware of the dangers of this tactical nuclear doctrine. That's the reason why China is still maintaining the minimum deterrence posture and chose not to develop the tactical nuclear weapons in spite of all nuclear strategy fluctuation of the US side. So I believe the increase of this nuclear instability threatens the security of the all countries in Northeast Asia, and this issue is one of the most critical issues for Beijing as well. So considering this context, actually the North Korean nuclear problem is undermining the China's national interest per se, apart from the US-China competition. So I cannot agree with the comment, the argument that China's role can be limited in the midst of the US or US-China strategic competition. Yeah.
Okay, the question for you, my question for you is, you brought a very interesting point. Actually, after Hanoi, North Korea said the original exchange equation is between regime security and denuclearization. But what they said is, U.S. is not ready, was not ready. That's why they asked, lift of sanction or partial lift of sanctions. But you said it's just rhetoric, and then we can make problem easier or more difficult, because sanction ease or lift sanction is like a marginal line. They cannot back off in Washington. Actually, this is become more like a myth, so cannot be said or cannot be conceded. That means make up this problem more difficult. But in a way, your suggestion is repackaging, in a way, Hanoi exchange equations. So do you think it really is back to this sanction issues, make this deadlock kind of open to solution?
So actually dealing with the security issue of the security concern of the North side is also very important part. And then actually, if it is a rhetoric, maybe we can make it a kind of the gesture. So like a warning declaration can be a very good gesture for that. But anyway, fundamental interest is still in the economic part, I believe. So if we don't have enough a concrete vision, concrete picture of what kind of sanction lifting is possible for their actual denuclearization measures or action, substantial. Without that, maybe we cannot make any progress from this stalemate, I'm quite sure. This is once again, I believe the whole the calculation of North Korea is tightly related to their economic situation or their aspiration for the economic situation. So I believe without this dealing with this question, it is not that possible to make any progress. Yeah.
Okay, I think you're right. It's even though they divided these two issues, but I don't think it's really divisible. And a question from the audience for Dr. Huang is, we need, this is basic and right, for denuclearization, we need continuous communications. So what do you think about this, recent reconnection of the communication line? Is this can be a good opportunity to go more?
Let me start in this way. So actually, communication across the border is always a good thing to prevent the escalation or accidental collision between two countries. So I believe it's quite a great thing. And one interesting point is the tone of their state media reporting this announcement. I mean, the tone is totally different from the previous statement or message from the North side. So I quote from the KCNA English version as it is. Now, the whole Korean nation desires to see the North-South relations recovered from setback and stagnation as early as possible. The restoration of the communication liaison lines will have positive effects on the improvement and development of the North-South relations. It's totally different from the previous remarks from the North Korean officials. So I believe maybe actually the decision itself and this tone of their state media can mean that they might decide that to change to reverse their very hostile or harsh attitude towards South Korea and outside the world after the Hanoi failure. Maybe it's mainly because they need some external help or support for their economic difficulties. And then once again, they are always fond of having some sort of the multiple options. In this case, China plus 1 or 2 or 3. So in this case, the rebuilding of the communication line means that they did South Korea as one option of these multiple options. But anyway, actually, if it can be a sign of this kind of the calculation change, it is a good sign for the next round of the nuclear dialogue, I believe. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have 7 minutes left. Is there anyone who give us the last comment? And I cannot see the panelists. Okay. Nobody? You said enough? Okay, then let me ask to American friends about this. Actually, I talked about that. I raised the question of in a way, the idealism that pursues the CVID for Mr. Kanehara. And the other extreme, actually, I want to ask the opinion about this extreme realism. You know, almost, I feel like it almost like it become consensus that in any cases, North Korea is not going to denuclearize. What do you think? That can help? You know, America more realistic, so they started to think about interim agreement. Or is it really cynical? That's just managing the status quo. President Hamney first.
Well, that's a complicated question. It's going to take some time. We have no choice other than to manage the current situation. I don't see that we're going to ever give up on the core point that a nuclear North Korea is very bad for everybody in the region. It's very bad for South Korea. It's very bad for Japan. It's very bad for China. So we're never going to give up on that issue, but we're going to have to manage the status quo that we have. And as Ambassador Lippert said, you know, North Korea has isolated itself. I mean, it has not communicated. The Biden administration has indicated it's willing to talk, you know, and it's indicated that there's going to be some sort of a step-by-step arrangement, but North Korea is isolated. So we have to manage the status quo. But I would say, Chancellor Kim, you didn't see, but Professor Jia did want to say something at one point.
Okay,
so why don't let's let Mark Lippert respond. He'll be better than me, and then let's let Professor Jia have his comment.
Thank you for your moderation. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm fine with letting Professor Jia go first, please. It's he's been waiting. It's his turn.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say 2 things. One is very briefly. Ambassador Lippert said China's role. I think China's role is very important, just like the U.S. role. Probably the U.S. role is a little bit more important in the dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue. The second point is we have to put the North Korean nuclear issue in this broader context of international relations. When China and the U.S. are head against each other, it's very difficult to get North Korea agree to give up nuclear weapons. North Korea will give up nuclear weapons under 2 kinds of situations. One is they have no option. So China and the U.S. and other countries work together so closely that they have no option. They have to go along, just like at different times they felt that way, especially before 2008. I think they felt that way, and also they have no option. Plus, they have a way out. Okay, so the Japan, South Korea, and China can give North Korea enough material incentives to allure them to accept this arrangement. The second kind of situation is they have security guarantee. The U.S. can give them, but then they don't trust it. Why? Because of the U.S. Election system, because of the prior practice, like Libya. So North Korea cannot trust the U.S. But international cooperation, if we make it a multilateral kind of agreement, then probably the North Korea will have more confidence in this kind of a deal. Okay. So, but at the moment, this is ideal. International society would work together, and then to put enough pressure on North Korea, and at the same time give North Korea enough incentives, and then we have a grand deal. That the current situation, we don't have this. As long as China-U.S. relationship is in deep trouble, we're not going to get it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Lippert.
Just quickly, what I would say, couple of quick points in the closing minutes here. First, I don't think DPRK can be used as an issue to solve the U.S.-China relationship. It's too big, too important on its own. But I would say that the U.S. and China could find ways to cooperate on DPRK that would help the situation on the peninsula and perhaps build cooperative habits in the overall U.S.-China relationship as well. On the question about realism, idealism, I would say first, we can't give up on the goals of denuclearization. Too important. In addition to all the global commitments that have been already discussed, there's also the commitment that the two Koreas made to each other in the early 90s about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula that's important. So for that reason, I get to the phased approach as a way to reconcile all these different conflicting forces. I think you could get to a rollback of nuclear. You could start to freeze, roll back the program in terms of its numbers. Over time, try to work to build up some of these habits of cooperation and trust between the different parties. And then you're into an end game with a smaller or a small amount of nuclear weapons under different circumstances. And I think there's a realistic shot if you ever got to that point to get to zero. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We are on time, actually. It's 10 o'clock. Thank you very much. I think it's the really wonderful sessions. And even though we are still feel like we're stuck, but maintaining status doesn't mean that we can maintain status quo. Sometimes it's more difficult than breakthrough. So I think we have to see the peace is #1 priority. Sometimes people are tired of this term peace, and sometimes too soft, too weak. But bottom line is, we all agree with this peace and stability in Asia. That means we have to go forward this stability in Korean Peninsula. It's everybody's interest. Thank you very much, all the audience on the web, and of course, great insight from panelists. As I said, the best of the best. Thank you very much, and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Kim, for the wonderful sharing. So this is the end of the first session. Once again, thank you everyone for participating in our conference today. And please join us again for the second session of the conference on exploring the road ahead, which will begin at 10 a.m. tomorrow, Korea time. So we'll look forward to meeting you again tomorrow. Have a good night. Bye-bye.